Hi, and welcome back to the HE Enable podcast. This is the show all about sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I'm Kath, and this week I am joined by Lisa. They are the director and lead consultant of Neurodivergent People, an education and inclusion consultancy. Before this, Lisa was a teacher development coordinator at the University of Liverpool. Lisa actually deserves a very particular shout out for coming on the show at very short notice. I think it's about 4 days to fill a gap this week. It's just obviously something I remain very grateful for. It's a pleasure to have her on the show today, and I cannot wait to get started. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kath. How are you doing? Good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you. I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Good. Please could you introduce yourself and share a little about your background in higher education?
Oh, of course. So, as you've already said, I'm Lisa Brennan. I'm the founder and lead consultant with Neurodivergent People, which is my education inclusion consultancy. And before that, I was working at the University of Liverpool as a teacher developer, which I kind of got into gradually through the ELT sort of route. So I've been working in ELT for, over 20 years. And as I worked through that, my interest in kind of helping teachers gradually developed. And I found myself working in the university then as well, partly in an ELT capacity and partly as a teacher development coordinator as well. So that's a little bit about what I've done in HE. I'm actually still to a certain extent working with HE in the consultancy kind of side of things, but I'm not kind of directly employed by any one particular university. I'm trying to kind of broaden my impact as much as I can. I suppose really kind of my background has always been, or for as long as I can kind of go back anyway, it's always been focused on trying to make sure that education is as accessible and inclusive to everybody as possible, even well before I knew anything about neurodivergence or my own neurodivergence. I wanted to make sure that education was something that everybody could access. And that's always been really, really important to me.
Honestly, what you do is as noble as it is necessary. So thank you so much for coming on today. You said you came in through a particular route. Do you remember there was an acronym you said? It was the route you came into teacher training.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's ELT, which is English language teaching.
Oh, okay. So is that like English as a second language?
That's right,
TEFL?
yeah.
Oh, cool. That is... Yeah, I had some family members who did TEFL teaching for a very long time, and definitely very necessary, especially in like the era of English as a lingua franca and being used to everything.
Exactly, yeah.
So, next question. If you are comfortable saying, how did your disabilities, neurodiversities, any of that, how did that impact your experience of higher education, and how does that inform your professional work?
Oh, that's a good question. So I suppose there's kind of two sides to this. So my experience of HE is going to be both as a student and then as somebody working within HE. As a student, I had no idea about my neurodiversity at all. So any kind of information or reflections on that are from me kind of looking back and thinking about it now with that hindsight. But I can certainly see how it did have an impact on me in terms of finding it way more difficult than my peers to kind of manage both the studying and the socializing side of things. Of course, I didn't realize that socializing was inherently perhaps more difficult for me as a neurodivergent person myself. So that, I found myself just constantly exhausted, constantly feeling like I was juggling too many things and wondering why I couldn't keep up with everybody else. Everybody else seemed to be able to manage, all of the different deadlines for papers and, exams and could still manage to go out at the weekends and have fun. And it just seemed to be beyond me. Also, looking back, I can see a lot of evidence for, the neurodiversity angle, because I started 3 different primary degrees before I actually finished one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Fair.
So, obviously now with hindsight, that it's pretty obvious, that sort of thing. But at the time, it was just, I just thought, well, it's taking me time to figure out what I want to do with life. So, I guess that's just how it goes. From the kind of the working within HE aspect, that was a little bit different. At that stage, I was a bit more aware, I suppose, of neurodivergence as a concept and as something that, was actually impacting both the students that I was working with and my own family. Because at that stage, my youngest child was already on the autism diagnosis pathway. So that was something that, was a lot more kind of present in my head at the time, that I was more aware of. I still wasn't aware of my own neurodiversity at that stage, but it definitely was something that I was becoming a lot more aware of in terms of the students that I was working with. I could, quite readily sort of identify students who were struggling with similar sorts of things that I could recognize my child struggling with. From my own point of view, I think academia seems to be a particularly difficult field to navigate as a neurodivergent person, despite the fact that it attracts a large number of neurodivergent people, because obviously, it's all about our special interests, and we love to do, we love to do our
Oh, yeah.
special interests, and we want to study all about them. But the other side of it, the kind of the office politics side, navigating careers, ladders, and all of that side of things is really, really difficult as a neurodivergent person, particularly because it's all about those sort of unwritten rules, the things that you're not supposed to do or say, but nobody ever tells you this. So that I was finding was really kind of weighing heavily on me at that stage. I was finding that side of things quite difficult to navigate in the work. I still loved, the teaching side of things, the teacher training side of things, but the more sort of, I suppose, the office politics, as I'll call it, side of things was definitely more challenging at that stage. And then it was towards the end of my stay there that I actually got my own diagnosis, and so many things made so much more sense. Kind of realizing the difficulties that I was having with navigating those kind of social situations, tied with all of the kind of things that I was seeing with the students that I was working with, and with colleagues as well, all kind of helped me to kind of, I suppose, crystallize my own kind of understanding of being a neurodivergent person within academia and within higher education.
So that's all really interesting, actually. So you've had it, obviously, in undergrad where you didn't really know you had it. Your experience sounds very similar to mine. I think it's kind of a tale that transcends time in a way. Because you would have done your bachelor's before me, and absolutely transcends time. It's very common that parents realize they're neurodivergent when their child gets diagnosed. Is that what happened with you?
Exactly. Yeah. It's as you said, it's a tale that transcends time. It seems to be a very, very common thread with so many people that I'm meeting and speaking to now, because our story is just it's one of those stories. My youngest kid, we were noticing difficulties. We thought at first it might be due to, we'd moved house, they changed schools, everything was a bit, unsettled. And then, these things weren't going away. So I think maybe there's something else going on there. So, we started talking to the school. The school kind of suggested an educational psychologist, all of this sort of thing. I think from the time that we kind of first raised some of the issues with school to them, and I'm referring to my child as them because they're non-binary, until them getting their actual autism diagnosis, I think was about 4 years. So too long, really, but it's pretty common, I think, in the current situation that we're finding ourselves in. But of course, 4 years is quite a long time. So during that kind of extended period of time, we were all obviously working through it with them. We were learning more about autism ourselves. We were learning about things like sensory sensitivities and, executive functioning and all of this sort of thing. And as we did so, the rest of us in the family started going, this sounds oddly familiar to me. So my youngest was obviously, I suppose, less masking maybe than the rest of us, probably just by dint of being younger. And the rest of us had more time to kind of internalize all of these sort of social rules about how we're supposed to behave. But when we actually kind of got past that, yeah, we were all very, very similar in terms of the kinds of things that we were finding difficult, the kinds of things that we struggled with, the kinds of things that we needed that helped us to feel better, to help us feel safer. So the long and the short of it is, after their diagnosis, my husband, myself, and my older child all ended up with an autism diagnosis as well.
That is quite the cascade.
And then my mum, who's in her 70s, also over in Ireland got an autism diagnosis too off the back of this, because she recognised, as obviously I was talking to her through the whole process, and she recognised so much of this in herself as well. It goes to show how much of this is, I think, genetic, but obviously as well, when people say, oh, there was no autism in my day, it's not necessarily true. It's just that we didn't know what it looked like. My generation and my mum's generation, we had no idea. We had no idea that this was what autism looked like. It's only now, as we're kind of expanding our understanding of these things, that it's actually kind of coming back home to us as well.
I've kind of seen the other side of this, where I don't have a formal autism diagnosis. I have what we call rigorous peer review, because it's quite hard to get a diagnosis. I have an ADHD diagnosis. Oh, yeah. The co-occurrence rate is quite high, but I've had myself and a few of my good friends got our diagnoses in our 20s, and we just look at our parents like, we got it from somewhere. Like, you should probably check this out. Instead of it kind of going, I think it can go both ways. It's like, well, I definitely got this from somewhere. And I think I spoke to her mum, and she was like, yeah, I just didn't worry about eye contact till I was 14, until I realised it's something people should do. And then I learned how to stare daggers through people. And I was like, oh, that's where I got it from.
Yeah, but, really, really, really common. And I think definitely, the kind of even going back up the generations can certainly stand to kind of learn a little bit more about it as well. It's funny, actually, you said that about not having the autism diagnosis, because I'm the other way around. I'm rigorous peer review, ADHD, but don't actually have a formal diagnosis for that. I don't, honestly, at this point, with the difficulties with medication and stuff like that. The only reason I would need for a formal diagnosis is to try and access medication, which I think would be really helpful, but I don't really like my chances of actually managing to do it through the NHS, so I just haven't bothered at the moment.
I guess the thing is that a lot of the reasonable adjustments you get are actually quite similar, and whether that applies to you or not, because I know you work, it's as a consultancy, but it's more freelancey because you're the director, you're the founder.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, because you have a lot more control over your work style, maybe that matters a little bit less because you can manage it yourself.
I know we in the community do say, self-diagnosis is valid, and it is, but there is something about having an official diagnosis that kind of reassures you a little bit. It's like, yeah, I haven't just made this up. This is really, really real, so that, you feel kind of confident actually telling people, yes, this is me, this is who I am, these are the things that I need.
To be fair, my threshold for peer review was so high. It was like a guy with a PhD in psychology who's been mentoring autism for years. He could do basically everything but rubber stamp a diagnosis, just look at me and go, yeah, you're autistic as hell. Yeah. It's well, fair enough. I'll take that as my bar. Right, we should move on to the next question. That was a great little chat. But we are on a race against time, as per usual. We're gonna go back. You've obviously mentioned that your undergrad was quite the experience. If I read your profile correctly, you went to the University of Galway.
That's right, yeah.
And then you did a couple of other bits elsewhere. And I'm going to let you chat about that. But I wanted to ask, what was your experience accessing higher education like from a disability standpoint? If you're happy talking about it, maybe entering your degrees for the first time, whether that's one of the three or whether it's the one at Galway that you finished. What was that experience like for you?
Really challenging. But like I said, I had no idea that, I was disabled. In fact, all the way through school, I'd been told I was a gifted child. I was, very intelligent. I should go on to do great things. And so I felt a huge amount of pressure going to university and felt that I never really lived up to this sort of potential that I supposedly had, because I just couldn't seem to keep it together in the way that my peers who were supposedly less intelligent, they weren't obviously, but the peers who had maybe like done less well at school or in exams and things like that were able to hold it together so much better at university. They were able to kind of manage balancing all of these different conflicting deadlines, conflicting pressures, the need to go out and socialise and the need to stay in and study and the need to work, because most of us were working as well to pay our way through university. And everybody else seemed to manage all of these things so much better than I could. I just struggled constantly to kind of find any sort of balance. And I suppose that kind of contributed to me starting and stopping a number of degrees before I finally finished one. And in fact, it's one that I've never used since. So, because it's a degree in archaeology and classical civilizations, which is very interesting and I'm still interested in. But I haven't actually used it since. So there you go. I think it's difficult to know from obviously coming back at it from the point of view of hindsight, but it's difficult to know what would be different if I were to try again with the knowledge that I have now. What sorts of things would have helped? I think just knowing the things that I struggle with aren't personal moral failings, but actually a part of the way that I'm wired, and it's something that a fair few other people actually do share. There are more of us out there than I certainly realised. Back at the time, I thought I was the only weird freak who couldn't manage any of these things. So that alone, I think, probably would have helped enormously. So I think from that point of view, it is hopeful looking at kids like my son who's starting university next year. Hopefully, it's going to be that much easier for them to navigate higher education from that standpoint, even just understanding why they might struggle, as opposed to just thinking, they're bad at things. And I think that alone is going to be a big help for this generation coming up.
It's a lot of normalizing it. And I think that's what's important. One of the reasons this podcast started in the first place is because we know the system isn't perfect and we need the lived experiences to show that. And, sometimes people have great experiences and we celebrate that, and sometimes they're not so good. And we acknowledge that. But I think the fact that we now have got to the point where we can acknowledge it and potentially make a change means a lot compared to where the sector was a few years ago.
Definitely. And there's so much more going on and so much more understanding there.
Absolutely. I'm going to do a quick plug. So I had the pleasure of reading a book you might be interested in, actually, called The ADHD Awakening by Sarah Kelly.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah, so I literally finished it this week. It only came out on the 13th of January. It's the 15th as we record this. I had the pleasure of reading it as a review copy. And very good book. But what I realized is like how much of what we learn in the neurodivergent community with like self-compassion and management tools and potentially just things that you adapt for yourself when you're growing up neurodivergent and you need to make coping mechanisms. How much of that like, you read in this book and went, oh, that's like not necessarily, normal. And I've either internalized this or I've had to spend so much time with myself. And it's such a reminder of this takes a lot of effort to manage as well. And I think people are getting more awareness of that and it's normalizing it a lot more. I think it links quite well to
definitely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that book. Obviously, haven't had the chance yet. There's like a massive TBR pile by my bed, but that'll make its way on there, I'm sure.
So you've mentioned it a bit in the past questions, insofar that we know that you struggled coming into university and dealing with, I'm guessing, just a lack of structure, which is a lot of like executive functioning comes into play for the first time when you lose the structure of school, and that can get messy. But I was just going to ask in general, and this can be about
Mhm.
your time as staff as well. Did you encounter any obstacles during your experience of higher education? Did you overcome them? And if so, how?
Yes and no, I suppose. It's not the best answer, but it's the true one. I think most of the barriers that I encountered were internal. So a lot of the things that I was struggling with were to do with my own perception of how I should be, what I should be able to manage, what I should be doing. And so that that ended up kind of leading to a lot of sort of masking, exhaustion, cycles of burnout, where I was just did not seem to be able to keep up with the things that I expected myself to be able to do. And that's something that I can see as a recurring theme throughout my life, but definitely when it comes to, education and my career as well, my career being in education, I suppose that makes sense. I suppose it's a bit of a tightrope, really, internally of trying to balance this need to achieve, to succeed, to realize your potential, because I think many of us have been told that we have a lot of potential as kids, and so we have this sort of like idealized image of who we're supposed to be, but who we really are never seems to quite match up with that. And then we have this like shame or guilt that we're not doing as much as we should be doing. We can't quite keep up with all of those expectations. So it's difficult, really, isn't it, to kind of work with that, to find your path where you stay somewhat sort of steady along the way without going too far towards inertia or burnout. But yeah, I suppose really that is going to be the biggest barrier that I faced. Other barriers would be, I suppose for me, I was lucky, relatively minor, because at the time I didn't have any physical disabilities. So that wasn't something that I was struggling with at all. The kind of social difficulties were just me being awkward. I suppose I could have done with a little bit more sort of help in terms of socializing, because we had, obviously, unis have like clubs and societies and things like that, but they tend to assume at that point that everybody is perfectly capable of socializing, which I suppose, we're 18 or 19, we're generally, at that stage supposed to be able to manage these things. But as you said, the kind of lack of structure was difficult for me. And I'm guessing would be the same for quite a lot of other neurodivergent people as well. So having clubs or societies with a bit more structure in terms of, what's actually going to happen, rather than just kind of like, hey, everybody, you all like books, let's throw you all together and you just sort of get on with it. It's not really very helpful if you struggle in social situations. It might work for neurotypical people, but for a lot of us neurodivergent folks, that's a bit too far. We need a bit more structure. We need a bit more support than that.
One of the things I was considering, potentially as a PhD topic, if anyone's listening, hit me up, is how, especially for people with executive functioning troubles, like especially I think with ADHD and dyslexia, how little support there is for that first transition to university in terms of or a lot of people finding out. I think the more important thing is a lot of people finding out they're undiagnosed and it just falling apart immediately, which sounds like it happened to you, it happened to me, it happened to other people I've interviewed. Emily springs to mind, who was on the show a while ago, where I literally was walking down the road with them and went, you sound really similar to me, and I'm on like the waiting list for ADHD right now. And they ended up, they're researching ADHD now and got their own diagnosis. And like it's at some point it's become so painfully easy to spot. But I want to just hop back to something you said earlier in that was you have this idea of who you think you should be. And I find that one of the things that's been very, I'm going to say interesting to come to terms with, and you can tell me if this is the same for you, is that it's actually more productive to be self-compassionate, but you're so caught up in what that image of you should be that it's the less productive option, but it's the one you feel like you have to live up to. And it's shaking that, which is the problem.
Definitely. And that's something that I am still struggling with to this day. And, I'm in my mid-40s now, so I'm going to guess that it's going to be a lifelong struggle. But yeah, it is. You're right. I mean, self-compassion is really much more productive in the long run, because I read fairly recently, actually, and it made so much sense to me, that the the emotions of shame and guilt are supposed to be demotivators. We feel shame and guilt when we do something bad that we want to stop doing. They're not motivators. They're not going to make us want to do something. So if we constantly beat ourselves up and make ourselves feel ashamed and make ourselves feel guilty for things, that's not making us motivated to do anything. It's, it really, it's actually having the opposite effect. The more we beat ourselves up, the less motivated we are, and the harder it is to actually do anything, because, we've essentially beaten ourselves into a corner and made ourselves too afraid to even start trying. Whereas for me, I don't know if this works for everybody, but for me, I find being so compassionate with myself, this sounds a bit bonkers, but basically treating myself like a really, really, really traumatized little toddler who needs, a lot of care and attention and reassurance, and saying, okay, this is really hard. What we're going to do is take one tiny little step. We're going to do one thing. Okay, we're going to do one small thing, and let's see if we can do that. And I'll give myself something like really, really tiny. Like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to sit down at our computer and open up that tab. Nothing else. You don't have to do anything else. All you need to do is sit down and open up the tab. Okay, that's it. Let's see if we can do that. And just kind of breaking it down. It actually works, because by that point, that's the worst bit, is getting started. And then when you've actually got yourself there, it's like, okay, well, now that I'm here, I can see what needs to be done. So I could do another little bit. And then, 5 hours later, you've gone down your hyper-focus tunnel and everything's fine. But it's that difficulty, I suppose, of getting started and getting ourselves motivated to get going, which, especially if you're feeling a lot of guilt or shame around how you should be, that can be really the most difficult thing to do.
I think that's sage wisdom. Wonderful. We're gonna stick a little bit closer to the questions now, because our
sorry,
are stealing time. No, this is me. I'm doing the tangents. You have no need to apologize, lovely. But with that, next question: were there any clubs, societies, or initiatives that made a significant positive difference to your experience of higher education? Again, for the rest of these questions, this can be when you were studying, this can be for work, this can be what you're doing now.
Club societies, not so much, really. To be honest, as I said, as a student, I kind of found them a bit difficult, and I was already exhausted with everything else. It just seemed like an added layer of things to navigate that were difficult, so I didn't really join in very much. I will say, when I did my master's through the Open University, and that, as an initiative, being able to study, and because this was a while ago, so it wasn't as normalized as it is now, but being able to study from home made a huge difference to me, my mental health, and my actually being able to do it. And through that, we also had, a kind of regular sort of online chat group where we could kind of talk through stuff like that with the other students. And that was really helpful as well, because it wasn't in person and it wasn't necessarily even face to face. We didn't often do like actual calls. It was mostly like, back in the day, a forum where you type things, which is great for me because, that's my best medium for communicating. I prefer to write. So that really, really helped me in terms of navigating through that degree. And then I suppose at work, actually having a couple of people who were sort of mentors to me. So people who took an interest in my work, in what I was doing, in what I wanted to do, and actually, kind of worked with me to make sure that as far as possible, I was on the track to be able to do those things. So that was really helpful as well.
The more I record this show, the more I gain a deeper appreciation for the OU. We had Maddie on the show a while ago. They just graduated from the OU, I think, last year, and like a couple of others as well. It's just so inadvertently And maybe explicitly like neurodivergent friendly. It's just sounds like a great uni.
Exactly, yeah. And it makes that so much more accessible, because at the time that I was doing my master's, I had two very young children. I was working part-time and I was trying to do a master's as well. There was absolutely no way I could have done an in-person master's, but having the OU, being able to do that way made huge difference. It really, really helped. And in terms of just kind of balancing things, it made that difficult tightrope a little bit easier to navigate as well.
Much love to the OU. This next question, feel free to answer however you please. No is a complete answer, but if you do have something to say, I'd be really interested. Have you experienced any instances of your disability, neurodivergence proving helpful in a higher education setting?
Yeah, I know where you're coming from with this, because obviously the sort of superpower narrative isn't particularly helpful. But I suppose it's good to recognise that we do have strengths and weaknesses, like everybody does. It's just that our strengths and weaknesses are sometimes a bit different from the average person's strengths and weaknesses, and who's average anyway. So, what's that all about? Exactly.
We can't just have the deficit model.
As long as we're not just focusing on deficits. Yeah. I think, we can say for sure, as a neurodivergent person, we do have, I have strengths. I'm not great at talking about them, but I do have some. I'm sure you do too. I'm sure everybody does. And, your strengths as a neurodivergent person are probably not the same as my strengths as a neurodivergent person. We're not all the same. We're not all made in the same mold. I suppose some of my strengths are also some of my weaknesses, though, because for me, one of my biggest strengths is empathy. But that's a major weakness as well, because it really can make things so much more difficult when you end up over empathizing with people and getting bogged down into kind of nearly paralyzed because you don't know how to help, you don't know how to fix things. And that's, I suppose, another thing is like the sort of systems that we're working within, because it's so easy for me to see where the systems are flawed, what the difficulties and how easy it would be to fix systems with the right buy-in, with the right support and resources. But I don't have those things. So that combined with the empathy, it's great, because, I genuinely believe that I can see how things could be made so much better for people, but don't necessarily have the resources to be able to make those sweeping changes that I would like to make. So that's, I suppose that's kind of strength and weakness in a package.
Like I asked this question because you never know what you're going to get as an answer, and some of these responses have been like very, very, very interesting, but it's also a lot of it's like a double-sided coin. Like it can also be that hyperfocus is great.
Yeah,
it's also exhausting and requires a lot of management. It's getting meaningful rest can be quite hard, but it means that you're doing loads, and it's always a balance. And I think it's a lot of that management goes into finding the right balance. But I'm gonna run with what you said just now about you wanting to change things. We're gonna chat about your consultancy work in a second. Before that though, so just one more quick question about kind of your diagnosis and that process. So you were one that heads of teacher training at the University of Liverpool for 5 years, and during that time you got your diagnosis while you were supporting other neurodivergent students. What was that like?
Well, the supporting of neurodivergent students was almost accidental. It wasn't something that officially I was doing. It was just that I tended to be really good at recognising students who were struggling. Now, because I was working within the English Language Centre, I was working for the most part with our international students, giving them support. Many of the international students I found, obviously now, awareness is increasing here in the UK about neurodivergence. I think a lot of other countries are maybe lagging a little bit behind, or there is a bit more stigma attached to these diagnoses still. So many of our students were coming to university in a different country, working through a different language, and were undiagnosed neurodivergent, but as also an undiagnosed neurodivergent person, but with a diagnosed at that stage neurodivergent kid, I was really picking up on a lot of these things. Now, I wasn't actually diagnosing these students, obviously, but I was able to kind of see what sorts of things they were struggling with, what kinds of difficulties they were having in terms of accessibility, and try to advocate as much as I could for them in terms of making things just that little bit easier, a little bit more accessible for them. I suppose one example that I can think of is because we would work a lot with other departments. So we would be giving support for international students. And actually, we ended up doing a lot of support for home students as well in terms of writing essays, all of that kind of linguistic support, presentation skills, all of that sort of thing was kind of geared towards our international students, but a lot of the home students actually came and found it really useful as well. But in terms of negotiating with the departments to make sure that things like the assignment rubrics were as clear as possible, that there were some examples of the kinds of things they were expecting, because as we've said, a lot of academia is about unwritten rules, and there's a lot of sort of unwritten rules around how specific disciplines and specific areas write a particular genre. So a report, for example, for architecture would look very, very different from a report from biochemistry. But the students don't necessarily know these differences, and certainly navigating them in, a second or third language is additionally challenging. So trying to navigate that and trying to negotiate with the departments to make sure that they were giving as much support as possible in terms of clarity and examples, but without them feeling like they were basically just giving the answers to the students, which obviously they couldn't do.
It reminds me, and I'm going to just signpost, if anyone's interested in how those cultural norms can affect neurodivergent folk, definitely listen to Emma's episode last week, because that was a lot about like stigma for depression and neurodivergence in global majority folks, which is, links very, very closely. So you obviously went from doing all the teaching stuff while like going through your own neurodivergent diagnosis, and then you ended up moving on to do consultancy, especially for neurodivergent support. So I've checked out the website. A lot of it's very school-based, like education, health and care plans, and helping people navigate circumstances. And to be fair, it's a very, very broad consultancy, and it covers a lot, and it's awesome. But what was that transition like from working in kind of teaching English and teacher training to being a consultant specializing in that kind of neurodivergent support?
Well, I suppose as I worked more and more with the different departments that I was working with and the students that I was working with, and then obviously alongside my own sort of growing awareness of my own neurodiversity and neurodiversity generally, I was realizing that the things that I was trying to put into place, I regularly advocate for universal design for learning. So kind of like a proactive thinking ahead, making sure that things were built in from the beginning to make sure that everything was going to be accessible to a variety of different people. The more I kind of advocated for this, the more I was like, what I'm doing here is too small. I want to be working on this, but on a bigger scale. I want to be working upstream a little bit, if that makes sense. And that's why I kind of eventually took the decision to leave and start this consultancy, because I wanted to make sure that as far as possible, the ideas that I have to help to change those systems, to make sure that they are as accessible for people as possible, that education is as accessible as possible for everybody. I want to make sure that those changes and impacts are as wide-reaching as I can possibly make them. And working kind of, although I was having an impact within the university, I felt that I could have a greater impact by moving outside that and potentially then working further afield, working with more people, working with more universities, schools, businesses even as well. So at the moment, I've worked with a number of different things. So yeah, I've worked with a few individual people, schools, universities, businesses as well. So as you said, there's quite a range there. But always my focus is going to be on this. I'm thinking of calling it universal design for life or living or something like that, because it's like the universal design for learning, but it's just thinking about these things from a standpoint of making sure that inclusion is just built in from the get-go, that it's a proactive thing rather than reactive.
And it's the principle that if you make it accessible for as many people as possible, that's going to be better for everyone, whether they need the adjustments or not. I was just wondering, because obviously what you do is so broad, I was wondering more specifically in higher education, how you've been applying your consultancy work there.
So what I've done is I've run a few workshops for different departments working on basically this sort of thing. So we've come up with a workshop that looks like getting together with a department at the stage. So there's usually a sort of academic cycle where, they'll plan or review different modules and things like that. So what we do is we encourage them to bring along a new module or a module that's getting reviewed. And we look at it in detail and we go through and start applying these universal design for learning principles, but through the kind of filter of neurodiversity specifically, because that's not necessarily going to be something that as many people are as familiar with as maybe making sure that things are accessible for blind people or, hard of hearing, things like that. Seems to be a bit more general awareness. Neurodivergence is still flying under the radar somewhat. And just going through this module from that standpoint, helping them to build in these sorts of accommodations, inclusive practice basically from the get-go. We can do it with just one sort of module that's kind of like a test, and then they can see how it goes, and then they can go off and run with it themselves. Or we then offer an audit where we can come back and we can work through other modules with them as well and go through a similar process. So we've had a couple of those go through with different universities, and great success with that. They're very, very pleased with how things are going, and the kind of the awareness that came with the workshop. In fact, I think may have accidentally, inadvertently triggered a couple of people to uncover some divergences of their own.
In academia, never.
I know, yeah.
Oh, that's so wonderful. It's wonderful. It's necessary. I'm so glad that's happening. I think at some point you get, or at least I've been getting like so centered on interviewing students and how we can campaign to make stuff better that we forget there are consultancies like yours that are doing a lot of hard work that, incredible. We got to our final question now.
Oh, wow.
I know how the time has flown, Lisa. So we've obviously covered a lot of ground today. We've started from your time at university, your child getting diagnosed and what that meant for you, all the way up to from your time at Liverpool to your consultancy work today. And I was wondering if we were going to take all of this and maybe condense it down to a couple of sentences to a paragraph. What is one key takeaway you would like listeners to remember from your story?
Oh, yeah. I think probably the key takeaway is going to be inclusion really works best if it's something that's already built in, something that you don't have to ask for, that it's just there, it's already there. It makes things so much more accessible, as you said, not just for people who necessarily need it, but it makes things just accessible for everybody. If you don't have to ask for it, you don't necessarily even have to know that you need it. It's just there. Because a lot of us are still undiagnosed. There are a lot of people out there who are navigating life as an undiagnosed neurodivergent person. And there are many of us who are diagnosed, but still don't necessarily always know exactly what we need in any given situation. But having options, having that accessibility and that inclusion built in from the get-go, I think that's going to be the key.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better. Wonderful. That was the end of the questions. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm just going to wrap up the show and then
Okay.
we'll see. So HE Enabled is the show dedicated to sharing our experiences of disability, neurodivergence, and long-term health conditions in the UK higher education system. I am always looking for people to come on and share their stories. If you are interested in doing so, please get in touch at henenabled@gmail.com. The link will be in the link tree in the episode description, no longer the show description. The show also has a Patreon now, so if you want to come and become a friend of the show and help me run this, it's only £1 a month. I see most of that money after Patreon's fees. So anything, if you want to come along, we're doing some early episode releases. It'll be great to have you there. I think that's it from me. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely to talk to you.
Pleasure.